For me, I suppose it's the way in which we seek to mobilize our industries and our technological bases as a means to try and secure ourselves. So we've seen this a lot from the Second World War in terms of the weapons technologies we try to develop so that we can secure our nations, ensure our national security. And I suppose today, one of the things that we can see around the world is cooperation and coordination as a means to try and create a vaccine for COVID-19, or as a means to just try and coordinate responses to fight this in the best way possible. And we saw that during the Second World War between the Allied powers and cooperation that took place in technology, in science, as a means to rapidly advance things just as quickly as possible. One of the things that I think is most relevant between the Second World War analogy and bringing that into the contemporary discussion about the crisis and the current crisis and pandemics is perhaps the mobilization of university staff and scientists and university assets as a means to try and, overcome the threats that face us. I suppose for me, from my research, one of the things I see parallels with is with these efforts to really try and weaponize atomic science, nuclear science, that we saw from the 1930s, but really didn't speed up until we came through to the Second World War. It wasn't until 1939 when a lot of scientists from across Europe who had to flee the Nazis came over to the United States, and two of the most prominent ones were, of course, Einstein and Leo Szilard, who sent a letter to President Eisenhower stating that they were extremely worried that the ability to split the atom could be weaponized by Hitler's Nazi Germany. And as such, the United States should start work straight away on a similar process in a race to create the first weaponized atomic bomb. That's exactly what they did. Roosevelt invites these two scientists, Einstein and Szilard, to the White House. They discuss some of the ways in which this really could have a detrimental effect and be a really war-changing weapon. And it's from this point onwards that vast amounts of national assets, money, American might, in coordination with the British, go into the advancements of nuclear science. You can start to draw some parallels between the harnessing of civilian infrastructure of the civil sector towards national security and the protection of the nation state. And you have seen that in the UK with scientists being brought in to advise the government and advise on vaccines and of course in every way to try and help model the virus. We're seeing scientists being brought in from all different sectors, but you're also seeing the commercial pharmaceutical companies who are pushing ever more forward with increasing government funding to try and race as quickly as possible to provide a vaccine. And of course, there's massive economic gain that comes with this, but there also has to be a certain amount of steering by the nation state of what they want and then what they think the nation needs so that they can be secured. And we did see things like this during the Second World War. We saw the harnessing of the civil capacity of civilian experts being brought into the national cause. I know that people like General H.H. Arnold, one of the heads of the US Army Air Service, who would later be the first head of the independent US Air Force. He had been working since the end of the First World War to bring in civilian experts to try and make new weapons technologies that could be completely unmanned so that you could fly them high over the enemy as a means to strike deep into their industry so that you could take out an enemy's war-making capacity and you wouldn't have to deploy the brightest, the youngest of US society into entrenched battlefields like the First World War. And so he brought in people like Charles Kettering and Donald Douglas. These are scientists, engineers, people from great industry who came in to try and make war-winning advances that could help save lives on one side at least. I think one of the most important lessons perhaps we could take from the First World War and the Second World War is this coordinated drive by government to bring important assets together to try and tackle this national issue. If we could apply the lessons of history, it would show that you need this really competent, coordinated response in place as a means to try and overcome the hurdles of coordination as quickly as possible and to solve these national issues. And I don't think that we're there yet. I don't think we do have that coordinated government effort to bring in industry, to bring in scientists in what you might call a Manhattan project for the times of COVID. The crisis of PPE in the United Kingdom, these lauded flights from Turkey that were sent across, I think it was RAF planes that were sent across actually to pick up that PPE, and for it to come across and not be given the right standards to actually protect those frontline workers, these medical professionals in the United Kingdom is, of course, a scandal. And you can draw lessons from history for scandals such as the munitions crisis in 1915, which really started to see the end of one government and the transition into a wartime government as a means to try and overcome this crisis. And you see Lloyd George appointed as the Minister of Munitions as a means to try and stop what was seen as actually a rationing of munitions on the front line. It was said that there were 3 bullets for each soldier. And so this mass national mobilization comes in place where they end up building the world's largest munitions factory, the largest the world had ever seen. In fact, they build an entire town around it. Lloyd George is in charge of this. It's arguably one of his greatest achievements. And they place it in Gretna, in the border region between Scotland and England. And they employ over 30,000 people. 12,000 of these are drawn in from the local communities. They are young women. They're drawn in from Northumbria, from Liverpool, from Manchester, from the Highlands and Islands around Scotland, and of course the more local region as well. And they're brought in to work in these munitions factories to make a new type of explosive that Arthur Conan Doyle is sent there as a journalist at the time to investigate what's going on here. And he calls this mix, this cordite mix, he calls this the devil's porridge. This mix of nitroglycerin and of gun cotton that's a more potent explosive. And so this is how they overcome this crisis. They build a whole new town, mobilize the female workforce and build the world's largest munitions factory. And it took a scandal, a change of government, a wartime coalition, and the creation of a whole department and a minister for munitions to overcome this crisis. So it's no small feat. I think one of the things that war tells us and the mobilization of wartime economies tells us is that you really do pull apart the existing economies that are in place, and it takes a long time to rebuild those economies. And we're going to have to be prepared for that at this time with the coronavirus. But one thing that comes out of great crises is great innovation. And we've seen that with wartime as well. If it wasn't for the amount of money that was put in, the national assets that were put in, then you wouldn't have the turbojet planes that take us around the world today. It was only in 1903 that the Wright Flyer first took off, and today we have these jumbo jets that will once again, hopefully soon, take us around the world. But also through to things like radar, and if it wasn't for the advent of radar, then you wouldn't have the concentration of microwaves, and if it wasn't for microwaves, then you wouldn't be reheating your leftovers in your kitchen. These are vast advancements of science. If it wasn't for wartime, then you wouldn't have the advancements so quickly of things like GPS that we use every single day in our phones, in our sat-navs, on our computers. I mean, it wouldn't be for war, we wouldn't have the internet. This is something as the ARPANET that came out of the Cold War as a means to try and coordinate different government departments as they tried to overcome the strategic and tactical issues of nuclear strategy. So I suppose that whilst war with one hand decimates the civil economy that was once in place, with another it offers whole new technologies that create new industries. I think some of the lessons that we can take from the way in which the public reacted in wartime are some positive ones. You know, a nation coming together driven by a national patriotism. And we've seen that with the combining of VE Day 75 celebrations, so the 75th anniversary of victory in Europe, the liberating of Europe. And of course, how we've tied that into overcoming adversity today. And I think that that's been really useful in the UK at lifting people's morale and spirits. But there's a warning that comes with this as well, and a warning that comes with any period of over patriotism. Because patriotism is great, but it can also be blinding. And one of the things that we've seen, of course, from wartime as well, is that when you passionately believe in the victory of your nation and the way in which it's responding to the oncoming crisis, then you can almost have a blind and deafness to the things that go wrong as well. And you can lose your critical eye for government decision making. And one of the things I think we need to take from the past here and apply it to the present is to make sure that although our governments are doing their best to overcome crises, we have to keep on being critical and asking questions about whether or not this is the right way of doing it. And that isn't being unpatriotic, that isn't being, against the national cause. In fact, it's our duty, or perhaps what the government would call our civic duty, to make sure that we're holding our governance to account. And this isn't just in the UK as well. We've seen this in places like Sweden, which has had a very drastically different response to the rest of Europe. It has continued largely as normal, although with a lot of social responsibility that is unique to Sweden to keep things in place. But Sweden also has this mantra of let Sweden be Sweden, let Sweden go its own way, a patriotism, and very much a pride that Sweden has its own path in this crisis. The trouble is that despite the fact that Sweden has been top 10 in one of the worst top 10 lists you can get, which is the impact of COVID per million on that society and death rates, there's been a 75% national approval rating of the government agencies in charge. So there's a pride in letting places like Sweden be Sweden, but there's also what perhaps you could argue is a lack of criticism here as well. And you can see small pockets of it in places like the UK as well. And again, it's one of those warnings from history that we just need to keep in the back of our brains to make sure that we don't let patriotism blind us. It's absolutely right that now is the time to be patriotic and to pull together, but to criticise the government is not to be unpatriotic. In fact, just like during the Second World War or the First World War, and as I mentioned, the munitions crisis, it's actually our duty to challenge the government decisions and to make sure the right actions are being taken so that we can overcome this crisis. If it wasn't for the Times breaking its story in 1915 about the munitions crisis on the front line and this scandalous expose about the rationing of munitions, then you wouldn't have had the massive government response to create the Ministry of Munitions, to put Lloyd George in place, and to mobilise the peoples and the forces of industry to really fill that gap in the war effort. One of the legacies of war, of course, is the way in which the state's control over national assets, over national industry, and of course over our own personal liberty can linger. You've seen this over a number of national crises, even most recently after 9/11, when the US government put in place the Patriot Act and a lot of limitations on US freedom of speech and liberty there as well, some of which of course are seen as rather disturbing for the very basics of human rights. But I do think that these tend to be repealed over time, and of course again it is our responsibility as nations, as citizens of a nation state, to really question why such measures are needed after a national emergency or crisis. One of the positives that comes out of it, I would say, is actually how new organisations are built after war. One thing I'm reminded of is how after the Second World War the world's first think tank was born, and this was the Rand Corporation in the United States. And this was a designated effort by the US Army Air Service and later the US Air Force to keep some of the civilian expertise that they once had to try and overcome the national crisis that was the Second World War, and to put them into one designated place with government funding and funding from great big organisations like Rockefeller and Ford to try and overcome some of the nation's greatest challenges in the years to come. So they had a model for overcoming crises and the personnel to do it, and they didn't want to lose that. And so they created this think tank, which was employed to create things like GPS or early rocket systems to help in the space race. But it was also put to more societal issues, social issues, such as healthcare and how you overcome the problems of healthcare in a country and deliver the best levels of healthcare. So I suppose there are many ways in which government can overstretch itself during crises, but there's also ways in which whole new streams of national betterment can be formed. After any crisis which has brought a nation together, I think that there is a call for fairness afterwards and increasing equality in a society, and especially more rights and protection for those who have perhaps been most heavily affected. During the First World War, we've seen the mobilization of female workers and the price that they paid in places like Gretna, the world's largest munitions factory, where they were physically maimed. They had long-lasting illnesses from breathing in a lot of the chemicals that went into the munitions they were making. A lot would die young in their early 20s. Some started working there when they were 16. And of course, after the war, there was this progressive drive to make sure that you could have the vote for everyone, and the vote, of course, for women as well. One of my concerns about this is that there's a myth that propagates here, because, of course, after the First World War, not all women did get the vote. It was women who were landowners or married or had a certain amount of money per year. So in essence, what we're talking about is it's the middle to upper class level of society that get liberated, whilst those women who had been working in places like Gretna, which were largely working class populations who were drawn in there, didn't get the vote at that period in time. And so again, if we're looking for lessons from history about crises, then one thing that we can think about is, as we move into a world where we're still dealing with COVID or coronavirus, but we're trying to deal with it better, how can we protect those that are most vulnerable, most heavily affected at this period?